Today we're going to start a new series. It's going to be a three-part series, short three-part series. And then on the fourth week, which is a Sunday before Thanksgiving, we're going to have a guest speaker, guest couple, missionary couple. And so they're missionaries to Belgium. Then their family will be here in town, and they're going to be speaking here at Solid Rock on the Sunday, and I can't remember the exact date. It's the Sunday before Thanksgiving. But until then, for these next 3 weeks, I want to talk to you about gratitude. We have Thanksgiving coming up, and it's a big event in our country, and it mostly centers around eating and watching football, right? But I want us to make sure, and I know you know this, but it's just a reminder and maybe a refocusing on what Thanksgiving is about. It's not so much what we as a country celebrate, but what we as followers of Christ should carry in our hearts every single moment of every day, and that is gratitude toward God. I believe this series is important because gratitude is at the center of everything that we do to serve God. Everything that we do. Gratitude is at the center of our worship to God. Gratitude is at the center of our service to God. We can't truly worship, we can't truly serve, we can't truly preach the gospel if we're not grateful. We won't grow spiritually. There'll be no spiritual growth if we're not grateful. And so we're going to talk about gratitude and how we're called to pay it forward. And I'll explain what I mean by that here in just a few minutes when we get to our text in the book of Genesis. But first, I was going to tell you a story, something that happened to us a few years ago when my cousin Edward was helping me pick up some furniture my wife and I had bought from a friend of hers, another teacher. She sold us some furniture in very good condition, and so we decided to buy it, and Edward had a big truck, big enough to put all the furniture in there, living room furniture. So he helped us out. He took us to this person's house. We picked up the furniture. We're coming back home, and he decided to stop by Chick-fil-A. Now, this is back a few years ago when there was only one Chick-fil-A, and it was a drive-through only. Remember that place? Just drive-through. Okay, so that's the one where Josiah started worked for several years. And so we stopped by that one, and he ordered some drinks and for all of us. And when we got up to the window, the young person there told him that somebody had already paid. The person in front of us had paid. You know how that people do that, so they had paid for our drinks. And so Edward thought, well, okay. He said, I guess I'll pay it forward. He says, I'll pay for the person behind me. How much is their bill? Well, it turns out they had just ordered, and they were picking up a nugget tray or two. I forget how much. So it was a lot more than what he had paid, what the person in front of us had paid for our drinks. And he just felt, compelled to do it. So he said, well, I guess I better go ahead and do it. He felt a little pressure. So he ended up paying for a nugget tray or two. I forget if it was one or two. And so I want to talk to you about paying forward gratitude and how that happens. Yeah, I said to you that gratitude is really the center of everything that we do, but there are other benefits to gratitude as well. I read this week online that mental health professionals are having to confront a very important question to them and of course to their clients, and that is, how can they help? The question that they're asking themselves is, how can we help our clients receive the greatest amount of benefit from treatment in the shortest amount of time? These are people who need mental health help, and we want to help them, but we want the treatment to be as helpful as possible in the shortest amount of time. And so they're researching, and in their research, they zeroed in on one thing that meets what the criteria is in their eyes, that will provide the most help in the shortest amount of time. And the answer to that is, according to their research, is the practice of gratitude. The practice of gratitude. In fact, there have been several studies over the past decade, I read, that have found that people who consciously and consistently count their blessings tend to be happier and less depressed. And so not only is it something that should be at the center of everything we do in our lives for God, but it's helpful as well. And God knows this. This is no surprise. You know, these doctors have researched it and they arrived at this. This is no surprise to God and should be no surprise to us as God's people. There are many benefits to gratitude. So let's define gratitude. I want to define gratitude, and then at the end of my message, I want to give you another definition of gratitude based on what we're going to be discussing. But gratitude is this. Gratitude is a practice of actively remembering and expressing the grace and goodness bestowed in our lives. And by grace, of course, we're talking about the things that we don't deserve from God. The forgiveness, the enabling, the power, the abilities. Grace is a practice of actively remembering and expressing the grace and goodness bestowed in our lives. Now, early in the Bible, we witness one of these acts of gratitude through the life of Noah. So I'm going to ask you to turn to Noah chapter 8. Noah chapter 8, beginning with verse 15. And I believe we are, I'm sorry, not Noah, Genesis. I believe, you knew what I was talking about, right? I believe that we are on YouVersion. If you want to look it up, it's a book of Genesis, not the book of Noah. The book of Noah where God speaks to Genesis. I was about to read that. The book of Genesis, chapter 8, beginning with verse 15. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land came out of the ark, one kind after another. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. Now, if you don't know the story, Noah at this point has been on the ark, on this big boat, for approximately a year, about a full year. And so now, after it rained, and now the rain has stopped and the water has receded, has gone down. Now Noah walks off the boat. He walks off the boat, off the ark, and then he builds an altar to the Lord. His first recorded act of as soon as he left the ark was an act of gratitude. What he did here is he built an altar, and this was an act of gratitude. Now, when we read this story, it's maybe we hear it told, it's easy to overlook this act of worship is what it was, this act of gratitude. It appears to be, okay, a simple practice. How many times do we read in the scriptures of people building an altar to God? They build an altar to God. Jacob built altars. You know, in the Old Testament, we know that they dug wells and they built altars. So we see this and we think, okay, he built an altar. Big deal, right? But this is really an extraordinary act of thankfulness, because first consider the fact that he had spent almost or about 356, almost a full year, 356 days on the ark, and now walking off the plank, whatever, his first thought was, I need to build an altar to say thank you to God. And why I keep saying, and I think this is amazing, is that we don't find any instructions from God for him to build an altar. He gave him instructions to build the ark. He gave him instructions when it was time to come off the ark, and he guided him through that. But we don't read that God directed him to build an altar to say thank you. In fact, at this time in the ancient Near East civilization, God hadn't given any commands to anybody. There were no statutes regarding worship. There was no organized religion. There was no faith that had been codified. There were no faith practices. all the faith instructions, the commands from God, those were still 1,000 years away. You know, in the book of Exodus, when we read the giving of the law, this was 1,000 years before that. So at this point, remember Noah and his family were the only ones that were saved when God sent the flood, because Noah and his family were the only followers of God. Among such an evil generation, they were the only followers of God. So there was no codified law. There was no code. There was no, moral code or any kind. It was just Noah following God, listening to God. So this was a singular practice that he did. It wasn't any kind of communal practice of his people. And it just didn't happen. Now, there were among the heathen, there were those that did make sacrifices, but they would make sacrifices to appease their gods. They would make sacrifices to try to convince their gods that they would receive some kind of good fortune. And that's not what Noah did. He didn't sacrifice. He didn't offer a sacrifice out of a need to appease God or out of a need to secure good fortune. He offered his sacrifice in an attitude of gratitude. He offered a sacrifice out of a heart of gratitude. It's like that was his natural inclination. He came out of this enormous boat. He comes out and he says, I need to say thank you to God. Now, he could have done many things. Think about what he had just gone through. Think of what he could have just gone through. For almost a solid year, he's inside a dark, smelly, messy boat, a boat that is just drenched in the stench and the mess of every animal on earth. And during this time, his boat would have been tossed by winds, by the rain, certainly, when it came, waves. And then when the water recedes and the boat ends up on a mountaintop, he walks out. And is that really, is it natural that his first instinct was to say thank you? For some reason it was to him. I would have gotten out and I guess I might have said thank you, but I would have just run, like, I'm out of here. You animals are on your own. But he just had a desire to do this. And so he built the altar, and God, I want us to look at God's response to this, because knowing his heart, he understood what was going on. And so read Genesis 8:21 with me. Genesis, not Noah, Genesis 8:21. And it reads like this: The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. This is the aroma of the sacrifice. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. And then God, look at the next verse. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Now, what we read here is that as the aroma of Noah's sacrifice goes up to the Lord, he responds in a way that he says, not only will I never again do this, but I'm also going to bless you, Noah. That sacrifice of gratitude, that sacrifice of praise caused God to say, I'll never again curse the ground because of man's evil heart. I'll never again send a flood. And furthermore, he blessed Noah and his sons, saying, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. So, blessing Noah was not a response to anything that Noah had done. His blessing was not because he was a great, ship captain and he kept the crew in line and kept all the stalls clean and kept the morale high. It had nothing to do with that. It didn't have anything to do with the fact that he built the ark exactly to God's specifications. I don't think it was a reward for taking care of God's last remaining creatures on earth at this point. I don't even think that Noah's blessing here that God granted him was a response to his obedience, although I do believe that blessings come from choosing obedience. But in this story, what we read is that Noah received his blessing because he chose to worship, and this pleased the Lord. This sacrifice of worship, this sacrifice of thanksgiving pleased the Lord, because Noah's heart was thankful and he offered this sacrifice. God was pleased and God blessed him. Now, let me turn the corner a little bit here and give you a little word study. How many of you like word studies? Did you like that? Okay, I'm going to give you a little word study, a little etymology here. Okay? In the Bible, the word gratitude is the word Eucharistia. Eucharistia. And if you look at that Eucharistia, this is a Latin form of the Eucharist now. But when you look at Eucharistia, you see the word. What word do you see right in the center of that word? Right in the center of Eucharistia. Do we have that? Did I forget to put that up? Okay, so Eucharistia, right in the center, right here. What do you see there? Charis. What does it say? You're afraid to say it. It's charis in English, right? Charis. And charis, does anybody know what that means? I'll give you a chance to tell me. Anybody know what charis means? Charis or charis means grace. It means grace. And so right in the middle of the word Eucharistia, that word is gratitude. Eucharistia is gratitude, and it comes from the word charis, which means grace. Now, here's the definition of charis, or grace. Charis is a favor. It's an act of goodwill and loving kindness which we do not deserve. That's called grace, right? Charis, or in English, charis. Eucharistia, then, understanding those two things, is an offering of thanksgiving. It should be thanksgiving. An offering of thanksgiving out of the abundance of grace shown to us. An offering of thanksgiving out of the abundance of grace shown to us. Eucharistia is to give thanks to the Lord with pleasure, right? With delight, not like the spiteful fine, the way the man in China paid his fine spitefully, but is to give thanks to the Lord with pleasure and delight, because we have received grace from God, because we have received pleasure and delight from God's grace, or God's charis. This is what the psalmist writes about in Psalm 51. He says, "Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise." So David is telling us that, is writing that God doesn't desire sacrifice just for sacrifice's sake. But he does delight in our expression, in our declared expression of thanksgiving, of praise, of adoration, and an outward expression of the gratitude in our hearts. This is why he said, "Open my lips and my mouth will declare your praise." This is what God delights in. When we do that out of a broken and contrite heart, God does not despise that. God receives it. God is pleased with that. Rather than just bringing sacrifices and thinking that with some kind of sacrifice we're going to earn God's favor. So then, gratitude, with everything we've gone through. Here's another definition of gratitude. Gratitude means that we receive the grace that God has freely offered us, and we give it back to him in praise, and we give it to others as grace. We receive the grace that God has freely offered us. He offers it to us, we receive it, and then we return it to him as praise, and we give it to others as grace, the grace that we received. We pay it forward. But it's much more than just paying it forward. See, we've got to understand that the gratitude we're talking about is more than just simply saying thank you. We tell our children, we teach our children to say thank you, right? But practicing the Eucharistia, what we're talking about is more than just saying thank you, but it's something that flows freely out of this sentiment of thanksgiving. It's more than merely recognizing God's grace, but it's a response that comes from that to God and to others. I read recently a news article about a police officer in Atlantic City who was responding to a man who was threatening suicide. The man was he was on the parking garage. It was on the 13th floor of a building. He was distraught. He was about to jump, and this officer got close to him, was talking to him. There were other officers with him, but he's the main one. He was initiating this, and he's talking to him, but then he saw the man stand up, and he thought, okay, this is my chance. The man was saying, nobody loves me, nobody cares for me, nobody will miss me if I die. And so the officer felt like, okay, it's now or never. He just felt the man's despair, he explained later. So he rushed toward the man, and he managed to grab him, and some other officers came and pulled the two of them off the ledge, and so they brought him down, and they're still trying to console him. The officers are trying to console him. He's upset. He's in despair. And later, this officer said that as he saw this man and kind of felt his pain that he was going through, all he could think at the moment, was, I love this man. I care for this man. So this is what the officer said to the man, a black man. They're gathered around him, and the officer, the main officer, was just kind of rubbing his back, and he's telling him, I love you. He says, I can't do that because I love you. And in fact, I want you to listen to a recording of this. I don't have the video. This is a recording that came from the body cam of that officer. It's about a minute long. Listen to this.
Pull me back. Pull me back. All right. Don't worry. You're good, bro. You're good. Come on, you're good. You're good. You're good. All right? You're good.
It's amazing when I hear that, and actually was able to see the clip. There's a lot of movement, so you can't see anything till the end. But this is a big news story. The reporters asked the officer why he said that of all the things. Why did you tell this man? You didn't even know him. And the officer said something to the effect of, I just felt like I loved him, even though I didn't know him. It broke my heart to see his desperation. He said, it broke my heart to see him feel so unloved. And then he said, because I know that I'm loved, I knew I loved him. And I thought, what a great example of God's grace being poured out in an expression of love for others. Paying it forward. When we receive God's grace in our lives, we naturally want to express it. We don't always know how it's going to come out. We don't know how God's going to use that or where it's going to go. But when grace is received, it desires to be expressed in praise like David, or in expressing love, and maybe doing something even more tangible for somebody else. It's easy to recognize God's grace in our lives when something amazing, something big happens, but sometimes there are subtle things that we need to understand that is also God's grace. I started to say a while ago that as parents, one of our biggest tasks is to teach our children to say thank you, right? We want to raise polite children who say thank you. If they have a birthday party and their friends bring the gifts, we want to make sure that after every gift is like, thank you. What do you say? Thank you, right? Because we know that there's always a response of gratitude for a gift that has been given to us. Friday night, we went to a trunk or treat event with our grandkids, and I walked around with Piper for a few minutes, who's 2, just make sure she didn't grab too much candy. She didn't get the concept of trunk or treat. Go to each vehicle. She's just kind of wandering around, chasing a guy who is dressed as a unicorn. She's going, unicorn, unicorn. Okay. So I follow her, but she would occasionally go somewhere and get some candy. And of course, like every good parent and grandparent, what do you say? At one time, though, she forgot. She was excited for the candy, and she got one candy. And I said to her, what do you say? And she said, candy. I'm like, okay, well, that's good. That's good. But say thank you. And, we want to teach them that. And that's a good thing. But how do we do when the opportunities to express thanksgiving or gratefulness are more subtle? Are we grateful when we don't especially feel grateful, or we don't especially recognize God's grace in our lives? I mean, when does God hear me offer caris for his caris in my life? Is it only in the very visible events? Is it only at the dinner table? Hurry up and pray so we can eat. How does my response to his grace sound? How does your response to God's grace sound? What does it look like? Is it always just a short prayer, or is there more to it? How does your response in worship to God sound? Is it a pleasing aroma to God? How do your actions of love, expressions of love for others, what do they look like? When maybe the grace that we've received is a little more subtle. Do I take the time to consider moments of God's goodness and God's kindness throughout my day? I mean, simply in the morning when you get up, do you get up and say like David, thank you, God, for another morning with new mercies? Do we say like the prophet and remind ourselves that God's mercies are new every morning? No, reheated blessings from God? Do we take time to do that? Sometimes we don't take time. We don't make time. I remember years ago I read a book by Steve Farrar where he was talking about how it used to be we would get awakened by our alarms to start the day. He says nowadays we're awakened by a starting pistol. Bam, and we're off. We're going, and we don't take time just to pause and reflect on God's goodness. When my forgetful and aging mother has a moment of clarity, and she talks about some things in her, just a beautiful memory of her life. And do I stop and thank God that he's gracing us with this moment of remembering with my mom? When I get to watch my grandkids having fun at the trunk or treat, do I recognize that it's only by the grace of God that I'm in this place, that I'm following them around and enjoying every moment? Am I thankful that I have the money to enjoy a meal, whether at home or at a restaurant? Am I thankful that I have the mental capacity to do my job or the physical ability to do it to the best of my ability? Do I thank God for those things every day? And do I share God's blessings with others that come from that job? I think that when we slow down, is what I'm trying to say, when we take the time to recognize the charis, the grace of God in our lives, we're going to desire Eucharistia, to give thanks to God and to return the grace and praise and love, expressions of love to others. I think that's what God is calling us to do. I think that's what God is challenging us to do with this word today. This is one more thought before we finish. There is this interesting phrase in an interesting part of the story of the Passover in the Old Testament. If you know the story of the Passover, when God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt after hundreds of years of slavery, and before the Passover night, this was the last night they were to be there. This was the night of the last plague. God gave the people of Israel clear instructions about what they should do when they left, and then he told them about how they were to practice this Passover tradition for generations to come. So Moses in Exodus 12, speaking on behalf of Moses, of God, Moses says this in Exodus 12:24. He's telling them how they are to practice this Passover feast. So in Exodus 12:24, Moses says this: obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. When your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. Then the people bowed down and worshiped. Now I want to call your attention to the question that the children would ask. He says, when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? In other words, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Because God knows that every one of us as humans are forgetful. God knew that if he didn't set this practice in place to help the Israelites remember their salvation from Egypt, they would eventually forget what was such an extravagant act of God, an extravagant act of grace. And this extravagant act would be forgotten among his own people. And so you forget something, you're no longer grateful for that thing. And without gratitude toward the Lord, then our hearts become hard, become cold. And so this is why God put this into place. So when the children would ask, why do we practice the Passover? God wanted them to be able to respond by remembering the Passover and explaining this with gratitude for their salvation. So it was more than, the Passover was more than a ritual. It was a practice of gratitude. Practicing gratitude. Receiving and expressing God's grace. Practicing Eucharistia, which is our love to others. Thanks out of the thanksgiving for what God has done for us. All that is the foundation for a life of joy, fulfillment, significance. It's important that we don't look at this season as simply here comes our time to eat a lot of turkey. And I love turkey and dressing, I do. But it's not just about that, and it's not just about a certain month of the year, certain days leading up to Thanksgiving. It's about our lifestyle and our hearts of gratitude for all that God has given and continues to give us. The Roman philosopher Cicero said this. He said that gratitude is not only the greatest of all the virtues, but he said it's the parent of all the virtues. It's the parent of all the virtues. The Stoic philosopher Seneca said that he believed that a spirit of ungratefulness ranked, he says, below thieves, rapists, and adulterers. Now, that's pretty harsh. Yeah, it's pretty harsh. I don't know why he said that. I couldn't find the context of that when I searched for it, but apparently that's the quote is accurate. He just thought that ungratefulness ranks below thieves, rapists, and adulterers. I just know, let's not be among those ungrateful people. Let's not be among the ingrates. Let's be grateful, and let's express our gratitude in worship to God and in loving others, and meeting their needs. I'm going to invite you to bow for prayer as we conclude today. I want you to just examine your heart. Are you practicing the Eucharistia, praise to God and love for others, grace for others? Are you practicing the paying it forward, worshiping God and paying it forward to others? Father, I thank you for this time of looking at this topic of gratitude. We're not surprised at the findings of researchers that gratitude makes for a more fulfilled and a happier life, because your word teaches us that. Forgive us for are times of complaining. We find it so easy to default to complaining, to criticizing, to looking down on others instead of looking at them with your love. Forgive us for that, Lord. I want to be a man. I want to be a husband, a father, grandfather, a pastor, a friend, a teacher who expresses gratitude to you in praise and to others in love. Help me to do that, Father. Help me to do that. Forgive us, Lord. Forgive the times we've been ungrateful. Forgive us for the times we have complained. Forgive us for our sins. Come on and ask God to forgive you, to cleanse you, to make you a loving person, a loving man, a loving woman, who carries the ability to forgive at all times, who carries the ability to love at all times. Father, help us to be that way. Help me to carry within my heart always the capacity to forgive and to love others. Always within me the capacity to express grace to others. And help me to worship you with all my heart, with all that is within me, Lord. And we do that today. In Jesus' name, amen.